It's the Bird Emergency. It's the show where we talk about birds, rare birds, threatened birds, birds that are on their way to being threatened, and the fantastic people who run the projects, come up with the projects, do the work to try and keep them around. And today, Leigh-ann Wooley from WWF, which used to be called the World Wildlife Fund. I don't know why they changed. And Leanne's the Species Conservation Manager for Western Australia. Did I get that right?
You did. Thanks. Thanks, Brian.
Terrific.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, look, it's a pleasure to have you on because we're talking about a bird that stacks and stacks and stacks of people would know from images because it's one of the iconic Australian little birds, and it's famous around the world in the world of aviculture, highly desired, has a history of being trapped, and that was one of the pressures on the population. But Leigh-ann, tell us about the Gouldian Finch and the project that you have been working on.
Yeah, well, the Gouldian Finch, of course, as you said, is this beautiful little rainbow of a bird. I think if a bird wanted to be a rainbow, it would be a Gouldian Finch, I'm sure. And I think the Gouldian Finch, it's been declining and threatened in the wild now for quite a while. And I think the first records of the decline really happened in about the 70s, where people were concerned about the decline, weren't seeing the bird as often. And that's when trapping and aviculture type trapping was really common. And so in the 80s, that trapping was brought to an end. And we still, unfortunately, we're seeing the decline. So, yeah, it's unfortunate, and that's why the bird still is listed as threatened on the Australian EPBC Act at the moment.
Leigh-ann, do you have a population estimate for WA that is reliable, or is it really a matter of guesswork?
Yeah, it's a guessing game with Gouldians. They're so mobile, little things, and very difficult to count accurately, especially because they tend to mob up in the late dry season when there are lots of juveniles in the population, and people tend to see them concentrated at water holes or water points in the dry season. So it tends to be a little bit inaccurate, and of course now there's much more awareness about this bird, so people are more likely to report them, so that the accuracy of the count and the comparison with previous counts is really difficult and continues to be difficult.
What's the habitat that they rely on? Like, are they really limited in where you find them? Are they sedentary in nature?
They're limited during their breeding season. So that's when they decide on a little patch of breeding habitat that needs to be fairly abundant in hollows, as well as usually it's annual grass seeds. So lots of grass seed, lots of hollows. And then they're quite sedentary around their breeding habitat and their breeding hollow. They don't move too far. But once that annual grass seed depletes and into the dry season, they then become much more mobile. And birds have been seen moving between WA and the NT. They can really, their wing morphology also shows that they can fly really far distances and quite fast. So for a little bird, it's quite an achievement. And so during the late dry season, there's not much research that's happened to date on where they go and how they go, but some of it with microsatellite DNA type comparisons and also localized analysis of their movements into the dry season have shown that they move much further during that time period.
So you've introduced that they need hollows for nesting. Are they adaptable with the hollows? Like, can they nest in crevices? Can they nest in, sort of like the sparrows do in townships? Can they find a man-made hole, or are they really choosy in the kind of hollow space that they nest in?
Well, in the wild, they've been found to be quite choosy of natural hollows, but they also take quite well to a design of nest box that actually mimics their natural preferences. So in Wyndham in WA, there's been quite an extensive program of research that's gone on there for many, many years, looking at the breeding ecology specifically, and also movements of the Gouldian finch. And that's where our little project fitted in. This research has been quite extensive and has found that they will take to the nest boxes and they will breed quite well in them. But it's so variable each year, and we try to figure out why. So hard to.
Okay, let's start with what we know about their preference for a natural hollow. What do they usually select?
They usually select quite a small entrance diameter, smaller than about 4 centimeter diameter, and they like quite a long, like branch type extrusion, and then they find the little section that actually connects to the tree. There needs to be some sort of hollow available within that they can make their little nest. So the first job I had ever had in Australia was checking nest boxes for Gouldian finches and their breeding success. So it was fantastic seeing these little things, these little tiny little babies hatching and they successfully fledging. But at the same time, their nest is just quite flimsy. They make a little grass nest within that hollow space. So, and they don't like, they compete, well, long-tailed finches compete for the same hollow spaces, and they create these really thick, really grassy, coarse nests, and that excludes the Gouldians from that area. They prefer their little flimsy, little, really light round grass nests where they lay their eggs. So very choosy.
So that's a limiting factor for the availability. That if a long-tailed finch has been in there previously and left all their rubbish behind, a Gouldian can't reuse that location.
No, that's right. And that seems to be right anyway. And when we remove, if a long-tailed finch gets into a nest box and breeds up that year, when we go back the following year before the breeding season and remove that nesting material, it's more likely that the Gouldian will come in and breed. So it definitely seems to be something that's limiting them. And that's possibly why they breed better in areas with a lot of hollows, and the hollow availability needs to be high so that they have the choice and they can find something suitable.
Now, I'm going to guess that because we're in Australia, that most of the hollows that occur naturally will be in eucalypt trees. What kind of age of a tree do you know does it have to be before it can form a suitable hollow?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting contrast with the temperate woodlands in the southwest in Australia is that, you get some really massive trees down there that are very old and take a long time to achieve those heights and that diameter. But in the north, in northern Australian tropical savannas where the Gouldian occurs, the trees are much smaller, shorter in comparison to the southwest. So you would think they have less hollows and it takes much less time to achieve the same heights and width that those trees do down in southwest. But actually, we're finding that it takes a really long time for savanna trees to grow too. So they might be shorter and they might be not quite as big, but they still take at least 80 years or so to create a hollow. So, and the processes for hollow, the actually making a hollow, we don't have woodpeckers in Australia, so we rely on termites in the northern parts in the savannas, and also microbial kind of ingress into the wood, and then also fire damage to the trees creates hollows for us.
Now, do trees with hollows get removed by agricultural practices in the north, or are people content to leave them alone?
Yeah, I think, any land clearing generally will remove all the big trees, mostly anyway, just as it happens down in the southwest. But there's far less people, there's far less development up in the north. And so there's less land clearing, luckily, I suppose, but it still obviously happens and the trees are removed and we lose those trees because of land clearing.
Well, we've talked about the preferences for the natural hollows. How was the design determined for the artificial nest boxes, for the artificial hollows? Was it did that come about by accident by using a box that was the target of another species, or had there been a lot of work gone into specifically a box for Gouldians?
Yeah, I wasn't part of that work. It's been done by Save the Gouldian Fund, and Mike Fiddler leads all of that, and some fantastic volunteer work, working with local Indigenous people to look for, firstly, look at what the natural hollows are that they were using. So there were studies done in association with Macquarie University, and James Brazil-Boast, I think, did quite a bit of that work. And after figuring out what Gouldians need, there was a really specific approach to trying, as far as I know, to trying to create something that they would use. So something that they would preferentially use even better even than natural hollows. So yeah, it was quite an effort. Impressive.
We mentioned in the introduction that the Gouldians are very popular as a cage bird, or really an aviary bird in aviculture worldwide. Are the boxes, I mean, do you know whether the boxes that they use or they prefer in the wild differ much from what had been used in an aviary setting?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. Yeah.
I tend to remember seeing Gouldians nesting in, the boxes that were sort of made for lovebirds. So I just wonder if in captivity they have become less choosy about their requirements.
Well, it would make sense because their foods are so readily available. So that's not a limiting factor. So if their food is there, they don't need to be as concerned really about what type of nesting habitat they have. that's so critical for Gouldians. They need that grass seed right there available to them. So I almost think, it's so hard. How do you find hollows and a lot of grass seed associated in the same habitat? So really, the environmental stressor there seems to me would take preference. What are they choosing? Are they choosing the hollow first, or are they choosing areas with high nutritional quality and food availability first? So interesting.
Yeah, can you tell us anything about the kind of grasses that they prefer? How I mean, I think a lot of certainly Australians would be familiar with the kangaroo grass, and then we've got the wallaby grass, the danthonias, and you've got things like the what is it, the cyperus, that's sort of looking a bit like a reed. What are the type of grasses that Gouldians need to feed on?
Yeah. So in the Wyndham area where most of this study has happened, and also across into Mornington through the AWC and their incredible work down there, we found that they concentrate the early dry season, so that's when they're breeding from March until about May, and then even later into the dry. They concentrate on the annual speargrass. That seems to be a dominant species that they'll feed on throughout that time period. Sorghum, Stipidium. So even when you see the little hatchlings, and their crops are just full of the seed. So they actively, search it out, and they concentrate just on it. So highly specialized almost. They don't supplement their diet with insects, and they use this annual seed way into the dry. And then once that seed depletes, even once the seed's fallen onto the ground, they then switch to having to search out the perennial grasses that are around the place. So like you said, the cockatoo grass or whatever is available. But so that's also why they push to move. They're having to search for these patches of rich grass seed across the landscape. So that's why they can be so mobile and move such vast distances following this resource. And it's really limiting on their population.
Now, you use the common name, the swordgrass. I wonder if that's what we would call the swordgrass down south. Like, is that a Garnia?
It's a sorghum
So
stipidium.
it's
Yes,
okay.
speargrass. Yeah. So it's
So
a different species.
yeah. So, and does that? I mean, I'm not immediately familiar of it in the wild, but does it have a similar growing habit to the cultivated sorghum? Does it have big seed heads held above the body of the plant?
Yes, and tall. A tall, like thin plant in comparison. Really, very heavy seed head, quite dense. Yeah.
So very high yielding. So,
yeah.
so I guess if the Gouldians can find suitable patches, that's a very high yield of that seeding body at the right time. Is the sorghum dependent on any particular fire regime?
So there's been some great work done by a colleague of mine, Dr. Anna Weir, from she did her PhD at CDU, and she literally concentrated on sorghum and what the fire regime does to this plant for Gouldians. So as much as she was doing a PhD on Gouldians, she was really doing a PhD on sorghum. It was incredible the amounts of work she got through, and really she found that the sorghum needs fire, and most savanna, fire is critical for the savanna ecosystem globally. So it's no real surprise. But what she found was that the crude fats, especially, and the minerals within the seed head itself, and the density of the seed on the plant was optimized by an annual or biannual type, burn regime. But the patchier, the better. So if you can kind of do one patch in a particular year and vary those patches so there's different aged vegetation, that helps also promotes perennials as well as the annual sorghum. So it really helps the bird long term.
And I don't know if it's in your wheelhouse, Leigh-ann, but is that a sort of a cool burn regime? Like, does a very hot wildfire actually harm the sorghum?
Yeah, that's what we're finding with a lot of the fire regimes in Northern Australia in the savanna. A lot of threatened species and a lot of threatened plants, animals, everything seems to respond to early dry season burning. And the early dry season burn will be, well, maybe I should explain that we have wet and then dry seasons. The wet season's from about November until about April. And after that, we don't have any rain until the next November. So that's our dry season, as we call it. And when the weather starts drying out, the humidity and everything starts disappearing a little bit anyway. It's still pretty hot. But the grass cures and it creates fuel loads. So the better the wet season and the higher the growth rates, that the more fuel load is available. So these early dry season burns can be, especially if they're patchy, because they'll generally go out because the humidity is still around or there's less curing. They tend to be much cooler. They trickle. They aren't extensive. They aren't fast. They tend to be really great for the animals and the plants that respond or are threatened. They seem to respond to this type of fire regime much better than beforehand, before there was really much fire management going on. And that's since colonization, really. With the removal of traditional owners from their land, it meant that the fire regime was dominated by these late dry season, really, really intense wildfires. And that's, we found that the influence of those late dry season, extensive, intense wildfires on sorghum, as well as tree hollows in the eucalypt species, it depletes the plants. It removes them from the system or decreases their abundance and their quality of the habitat. So, yeah, it's quite interesting and quite not really surprising, but really interesting that these trends are so obvious, and that's why the Gouldian's almost an indicator of great land management. What that looks like.
So, in recent years, the understanding of the required fire regimes to effectively manage these northern Australian savanna grasslands and the rangelands more generally are much better understood. So, are you seeing an increase in non-traditional land managers to replicate that fire regime now?
Yeah, for sure. In the Kimberley, there's a lot of land is under native title. So like 90% of the Kimberley is under native title. So there's such great collaboration within different organizations. There's Indigenous-led cultural burning that's going on. And a lot of that collaboration and integration, as you've said, has resulted in the combined two-way type science approach that uses traditional knowledge, traditional skills, traditional knowledge of fire regime and integrates it. So within the scientific research contemporary side of it, this integration has shown that this early dry season patchy mosaic burning that's much cooler, much less intense is really beneficial. And yeah, it's a great integration of knowledge systems. Really, really fantastic.
And the sort of station managers are taking that on and now putting that in their management plans.
Yes, some, yeah, for sure. There's still lots of work to be done, but yeah, some are really fantastic champions of this type of fire regime. But pastoralism, obviously, like fire regime for pastoral objectives can be quite different to biodiversity objectives. But in general, there's a collaboration between different groups to conduct the burning, to protect each other's properties, to do things together. So it's a great model of collaboration.
So you're quite positive that will continue to improve?
Definitely,
Okay.
for sure. And in the Savannah too, there's a lot of incentive for it as well, because there's carbon projects available, so this kind of, the laws are changing. There's a little bit of an increased incentive to take on carbon projects or carbon abatement projects. And then the peninsula, the Dampier Peninsula, where I'm based in Broome, and the Dampier is just above me, and it's Pindan vegetation, and Gouldians occur on that peninsula, and the Badi Jawi and Nyonyo Rangers do a lot of work to try and help protect the Gouldian on the peninsula. And there, the Pindan is not quite yet within the Savannah carbon methodologies yet. It hasn't been included, but there's a lot of work going ahead to try and do that. So with carbon incentives, the collaboration incentives, the work showing that this is producing fantastic results, I'm very optimistic that this is the way forward. And it's incredible the amount of technology that's being used, satellite technology to map fires, to use this to land managers, fire managers are using these cutting edge technologies now to manage and plan and look at the impact and the results post fire management too, and track their management year by year. So it's really to me we're leading the world in this space, and Savannah fire management in Northern Australia is world leading. It's fantastic, and I'm really optimistic for the future.
Well, that's really good news. You mentioned the pandan habitat. Now, that's the pandanus. We call it a common palm, but it's not really a palm. But if the Gouldians are using a predominantly pandanus sort of landscape, is that for feeding? Is that a non-breeding area, or are there opportunities for them to find hollows in that habitat too?
Yeah, well, the pandan is not completely dominated by pandanus. There are patches of pandanus in the little wetter patches, but pandan is that red soil, red dirt, eucalypt, but also dominated by an understory of wattles. there's a lot of and there's a concern about thickening actually due to wattles and the previous fire regime that encouraged wattles within the system. So there are some eucalypts within the Pindan, and especially up in the northern parts of the peninsula, there is breeding habitat, and the Badi Jawi Rangers have made extremely amazing efforts towards protecting Gouldian Finch woodlands, breeding habitat, and their fire regime. Specifically, they're trying to make sure that their fire regime is what the recommendations kind of say could optimize that habitat. And yeah, they're making great efforts along that way, and also collaborative efforts, like you say, and since 2016, this has been a primary objective, and we also support their fire program. So it's a great opportunity to support cultural burning as well as having biodiversity benefits and benefits for Gouldian finches. It's a great project and good results. So.
Oh, it's good to hear some good news.
Yes.
There's not often a lot of it. I'll try and find some pictures that I can use on the site to sort of illustrate those different habitat types and the vegetation mix, because it's something that we're not really familiar with down in the south. And if you haven't been up to the Kimberley and to the fringes of the Pilbara, it will be quite foreign to you. So we might collaborate on those, on
For
sourcing
sure.
those photos.
For sure.
Now, we mentioned that there was competition with the long-tailed finch for nesting opportunities, but who are the main competitors for the Gouldian in the wild?
Well, it is other seed-eating grass finches, really. They're so specialized, like I said, with the masked finch and the long-tailed, pretty much are the most common competitors, I'd say. Also targeting grass seed, obviously, but then they also supplement their diet with insects and various other. They'll take different species of grasses, whereas the Gouldian will concentrate on the sorghum to begin with. So I'd say those two grass seed eaters, the granivorous finches, and there's a lot, there's resources available, so it shouldn't be a problem. In other words, I don't think that that's a primary threat, except in the hollows and the nesting within the hollows. I don't think, these finches are outcompeting them drastically. That'll cause the population declines we've been seeing.
And predation is always a concern. Is cats a big problem, or are the natural native predators the main predation threat?
Everything, unfortunately. These little things tend to get taken by a lot of things. I wouldn't say if they're because they come down, especially during the dry season, to feed on the seeds that have dropped. So that makes them much more vulnerable because they aren't foraging on the ground to cats, for example. So yeah, it's a terrible time of the year for them, that late dry season. The seeds all on the ground. They're more exposed because it's drier. There possibly been fires coming through, and we know that feral cats prefer to hunt more effectively and efficiently in these recently burnt open areas where there's less protection. So it's just an awful time of year for these poor little things. And of course, they're so brightly colored, you can't miss them. So yeah, I think any predator would be attracted to them, unfortunately. Yeah.
And the feral cats very prevalent up there in the north?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're causing havoc, but as they are everywhere else, a lot of my colleagues overseas are very surprised at our difficulties. It's people are not that aware of how incredibly important feral cat predation is within the Australian context, and it's just absolutely devastating. There's pretty much a biodiversity crisis in the north too, and dominated by feral cat predation, as well as integrated within the framework of other threats as well. So feral cat predation can really be interactive with grazing, by feral herbivores, large ferals and cattle. So, and then the fire regime on top of that, and how it all interacts and causes this terrible multitude of threats that really most mammals and birds up in the north are suffering the consequences.
So, dear listener, if you are listening and you are a cat owner, two things: please have your cat desexed, and please keep it inside, because every cat is a threat. There's no such thing as my cat never catches wildlife. You just don't see it. So please keep it inside. Let's talk a little bit more about the habits of the Gouldian finch. Are they able to occasionally get two clutches successfully hatched and reared in a season?
There are, but not very commonly, unfortunately. I think the estimate is about a 20%. 20% of the breeding pairs will go on to have a second clutch, and the success of that, the fledging is, or the success of the breeding is not always 100%. So, as much as they would try and have a second clutch, sometimes there's no success there anyway. So, quite limited.
And an average clutch size would be what?
Probably about 4 or 5 little eggs.
And successful fledging, 1 to 2, 3?
I think on average what we were finding in the nest boxes was about 3 out of the 5. Yeah, more commonly. But once they hatch, and especially in that first clutch, there's quite high success rate of fledging, so which I found quite surprising. So both the parents, both the adults will feed the young. So it's quite incredible how much they move and how much seed they collect. And like I said before, the little crops are bulging full of these seeds. So they're very busy trying to rear their young, get them to fledge. And they often, once they reach that stage, they are successful. So it's great to see.
How rapidly can a hardworking Gouldian pair go from prospective partners to successful parents?
How rapidly? I think it's about 60 days actually, within from hatching until successful fledge, if I remember correctly. So it's quite a long time, to be honest, to be that busy and that active with 3 to 5 little mouths to feed. So really interesting.
About how long does a Gouldian live?
That's also another concern, is that, like I said before, often you can see Gouldians gathering at waterholes at the end of the dry season, and probably 80% of that population are juveniles. And right at the end of the dry too, the juveniles are molting and getting their adult plumage. So it creates this environmental stress again for these poor little things that are looking for food and water and molting. And there's estimates that the adults don't survive after their first year, and most adults don't survive into their second. So, and there's very high juvenile mortality too, for various reasons, mostly forage related, food related.
So they have to be opportunistic, and they have to be rapid breeders. Otherwise, they just simply can't go on. Or they're quite widely distributed across the north. I mean, they've been recorded right from the top end, the western fringe of the top end, right round into the eastern side of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Do you think that is sort of a contiguous population? Like, are they over time? Are the genetics shifting from west to east and back and forward, or do you think they're a bunch of isolated populations these days?
Yeah, there's been a little bit of work done to try and look at exactly that, and most people estimate that, especially during the breeding season, obviously they'll be really restricted. So and almost fragmented, you would say, but their ability to move once they're not breeding makes their distribution seems continuous, but actually it's just movement between little patches and little populations. But some work that was also done on mitochondrial DNA or microsatellite DNA, I think, showed that the populations in the Kimberley are almost like a source population, and the populations in the NT are a sink. So that's that classic meta-population theory, where the birds that are flying to the NT don't necessarily make it. So that it's like a sink that birds are dying in those populations, or those populations are declining, whereas the Kimberley populations are increasing a little bit in these little fragmented bits and pieces. So it's really difficult to kind of get your head around how they move, why they're moving, where they're moving to, what's happening where they move to. And so is that an increase or is that a decrease in the overall population?
So let me see if I understand what you just said. I'll try and put it into non-science. The core population, the base population, is the Kimberley population. And from there, it spreads out. And because they're opportunistic, if they get lucky on the sort of as they extend their distribution, they might set up another base there if they have good seasons, and from there can continue moving on. But if the seasons don't work in their favour, the stable population is the Kimberley population, and all the rest of them are sort of opportunistic. And have I got that right? That in the dawn of time, the Gouldian was a Kimberley bird that has managed to just spread out.
I'm not sure that that's true, but maybe it could even be the reverse. But what we're seeing now, what we're seeing more recently, is that there's like this little transfer going on between the Kimberley and the NT and the north, the top end. So there are other populations within the NT, for example, in the Yunbury Hills and in Catherine area, and where the birds are breeding. So there's so much weird little dynamics going on, and we're not quite sure what's going on overall with the population. And it's so hard to count them. It's so hard to be sure. So there's been some great work being done in Wyndham again in WA, where the little microsatellite tags are being put on the birds, and there's been a lot of work to look at how they move where they're moving to and what it is that they're targeting. And yeah, it's still work in progress. There's a PhD student that's just finishing now, so I'm keen to hear what her findings are and the results of that, because I think that'll give us a lot of great insights into how they track their resources and why they target certain things, and then we can possibly get a better idea of the broader population and what is happening in each of the states, although that doesn't matter to them. But
No,
yeah, that
that's
matters
right.
to us.
But the management regimes cover 2 states and 1 territory and spans the entire top end of Australia. So it's a very large geographic area. I just was curious when we were talking about distribution, over what portion of the range do you know have people been putting up nest boxes, artificial hollows for the birds to use? Has that been done just sort of in your area in Western Australia, or are people doing it across the top end?
I haven't heard of any extensive nest box projects other than the big one in Wyndham. People have, modeled. It's just like locals that are interested have kind of modeled their nest box design possibly after that and just put them up locally. But there's no, legitimate research project as such going on with nest boxes that I know of anyway, across the north. But yeah, why not?
Sounds like a good citizen science project that could come on. Because one of the great problems in conservation work is that rarely has there been enough resources put into properly gather all of the information that's required. So the best decisions are made often by educated guesswork rather than a really firm suite of studies. So I guess we just got to hope that we've got the Save the Gouldian is there, but that hopefully the 3 governments that are the guardians of the Gouldians. There's a movie franchise that needs to be made. That there's a whole lot of coordination. Because, as I'm sure you are well aware, that one government will do one project and fund one researcher for 6 months, and then another one will do something with 2 researchers for 2 years, and they don't often overlap, and they often aren't sharing information other than through the journals, and sometimes that's not the most effective way to do it. So hopefully the Gouldians can overcome federalism.
Let's hope so. Well, and that's the thing, there really are quite a few experts now around, and they're so open to a call, or so I think there's more to be said about individual champions within the federal system that really push the collaboration and the information sharing, and it's really there's a lot to be said for those individuals. So it's really great that there are some people within the system that are fighting.
But in itself, that can often be a threat, though. And I don't mean that's anything about the individuals, but you're a case in point. You were working in another continent and you've come here. So all of that knowledge that you have about where you used to be is now sitting in Western Australia. What we have with short-term funding opportunities for researchers for academics means that often the knowledge, any knowledge that hasn't been committed to a paper and submitted to a journal is lost if the funding is not available in that region to keep those people working in that region. And that's a huge problem worldwide, but we, particularly in such a large country as Australia, if somebody is a specialist in the Kimberley, but they can only find work in Tasmania for the next 2 years, well, they're obviously not telling somebody else about Gouldian finches while they're standing there with a pair of binoculars each watching them at a waterhole. And that's often the best way of transmitting information.
That's exactly right. And that's why I think Indigenous land management is so important up here too. That's the continuous knowledge. That's where we learn from, and that's where, there's so much to be said for Indigenous land management and knowledge transfer there too. So I think it's also important that we communicate, like you say. We need to communicate with each other and make sure there's longevity and handovers or the next projects, or at least getting the word out that new stuff is being done, and then make a few phone calls, phone around, talk to people. It's worth it. Even as a PhD student, you might be hesitant, but it's so worth it. Just reach out. People are really willing to share their knowledge. So,
Now, you've beautifully brought it around to where I wanted to get to about that knowledge transfer, and not only with the Indigenous land managers, the TOs, the traditional owners, TO for all the people overseas. That's our Australian jargon nowadays for the Indigenous land managers. You're working for WWF now. In times gone by, somebody with your depth of knowledge of the Gouldian, for instance, would be talking to me from a university department or from the Department of Conservation, whatever name the state had. But WWF, an international NGO, is that becoming more of the role of WWF? Because I'm a fair bit older than you. I've known about WWF for a long time, and obviously the panda logo. And first, we were giving money when I was a kid to save the pandas, but it's always been seen by me, people my age, as being a very effective fundraiser. But now it seems to be a far more of a practical, on the ground organisation as well. Have I got that assumption right?
Well, I think there's a lot of balance within WWF, which is great. We have all our work is science-based, so that's a great start to begin with. Then, for example, the bushfires in the southeast, obviously we respond to crises, and so when there's fundraising around a certain crisis, we respond there. So our concentration is dictated by what the community is concerned about. And my role as species conservation manager is species related, threatened species related more specifically. And I'm a little bit different up in the Kimberley because my work is very on ground. A lot of work that happens elsewhere is about partnerships, really incredible partnerships between WWF and other on-ground, organizations too. So there's that many-layered type approach and a very broad and balanced in the end approach that we take. So as much as, yes, my work is definitely a lot of on-ground work, there's also other work that's about advocacy and campaigning and policy change. And so there's a huge remit across the organisation, and I think that's what NGOs really are working towards too, is trying to find their most effective space that we can influence really critical areas if we can, because as you said before, funding's limited no matter what organisation or institution you're in. So we have to be really careful about where we spend that money and who our donors are and what they want us to spend it on. So yeah, in the Kimberley we have incredible partnerships with the Indigenous rangers, and my work is working with them on ground on specific culturally important threatened species projects. And the Gouldian Finch is one of those threatened species that we work with the rangers on the Dampier Peninsula on. So yeah, it's a great model and it's working well. So.
Are you genuinely confident for the future of not only the Gouldian, but the threatened species in the Kimberley region? Are you confident that things are improving, or are we still pushing it uphill?
Yeah, I think with the little funding we have generally across the conservation remit, we're always pushing things uphill. There's never quite an easy way out kind of thing. But I'm very, very optimistic for the North. I think we're coming to understand exactly what the problems are, as intricate as they are, and we're trying to deal with the threatening processes that are causing the most harm. So fire management is huge. So, and as we've spoken about before, that's on the way to incredible strides ahead. So the other threats like feral cats or, feral herbivores, for example, those are all things that kind of are interactive with fire. So I feel like if we prioritize different threats and threat management, there'll be progress on the others in the future too, even through the first, investing in the first. So I'm very optimistic that we can get on top of this. But it's been quite a while now since the flag is raised. There's been real concern about the crisis in Northern Australia. John Wonarski published a paper from Kakadu in about 2010, I think it was, raising the initial concerns for mammal decline, especially in the north. So there's been, there's a lot of work still to do, but there has been a lot of work to date too. So yeah, I'm very optimistic we can make some great inroads.
Do you think we have started the arrest of the land clearing problem in the north? And I don't mean to say it's only a problem in the north, but there's perhaps more to preserve left up there than we have the opportunity to preserve in most of the habitats down south. So I guess what I'm asking, and it's an anecdotal thing, obviously, but do you think the land managers, the non-traditional land managers, are more aware of the issues around land clearing and are more reluctant to go ahead and clear remnant or surviving altered vegetation habitat?
Yeah, it seems to be, people are more aware, and especially up here in the Kimberley, people know that we're having this incredibly biodiverse region up here. So people are very concerned about the loss of species, the loss of biodiversity, even if your land tenure is different to a conservation objective. Generally, people are aware of how special the Kimberley is. So that there's a certain amount of consensus around not clearing everything if possible, and there is far less clearing. But whether that's to do with just there being a less populated area or not is another story. We still have quite extensive pastoralism up here. So, and pastoralists are aware of conservation issues too, which is great. And they're very aware of collaborative efforts for conservation. So it's great.
Hopefully we've turned the corner on that issue worldwide, I hope.
I hope so, yeah.
But time will tell. Now, Leigh-ann, I think we've covered off that project pretty well. So let's talk about Leigh-ann. You told me before we started that you've been here in Australia for 6 years. So tell us a bit about the difference working in science and conservation between, and tell us where you were and what it's like in Australia.
Yeah, well, my previous life was in South Africa, and my previous job just before coming to Australia was in the Kruger National Park in South Africa. And I was doing a postdoc there on savanna drivers, really. We were throwing some nutrients and water around the savanna and having a look at response and looking at big herbivores and how they impacted the savanna and fire impacts too. So it's a totally different system as such, but there's still this weird familiarity about the savanna, and that's what attracted me to Northern Australian savannas. It's this kind of, it's still savanna. It's still savanna. I might not have the elephants running around or the lions to contend with, but that's a good thing. And there's still some familiarity even in the species you see some genus similarities and the grass tree dynamic that is classically savanna, it still plays out in the north. So while there's some really big differences, there's also some similarities. So I don't feel completely out of my depth here. And being an ecologist too, and a savanna ecologist, it's been such a great learning experience. Really enjoyed being in a new system, in a new place.
Well, South Africa and Australia have a lot of historical, cultural similarities, but how different is it? Don't want to make it too broad, but sort of the how the scientific communities in ecology and conservation operate. Is it very, very similar? Like when you transplanted yourself here, was it a massive change or was it just a big geographical change, but life goes on?
Yeah, I would say probably the latter because, our university systems and our academic systems in South Africa are really, really incredibly strong, and there's some great collaborations with overseas universities too. For example, when I was in Kruger, I was working with Princeton University and the University of Cape Town. So these great, strong collaborations. People are always interested in Africa. So we have these incredibly intelligent academics that still lead our science over there. And there's a lot of global kind of communication and overlap with certain systems like the savanna. So where fire is so dominant and so important, there's often a lot of collaboration and information sharing globally about how to manage these systems and manage them for biodiversity. So yeah, I guess that's what also attracted me to WWF, is that global perspective too, and that global connection, and how can we learn from each other globally as well as locally to affect change.
So your role at Kruger, was that with WWF as well?
No, it
No.
was with the university. Yeah.
Okay. So usually I'm talking to bird nerds, but you're you're a bit more more general in your animal tastes.
Yes, I suppose you could say I am a true ecologist. I really love the system. I love thinking about all the components of the system, whether it be birds or mammals or trees or whatever it is, and trying to understand the dynamics. That's really what gets me. So I love watching birds because I love knowing how they form the part of the system that they're in. But I wouldn't necessarily call myself a birder, unfortunately. I wouldn't give myself those kudos. But I love birds and I love knowing what that bird is that I'm looking at that moment. But I wouldn't say I'm a twitcher or a chaser or a lister of any kind.
but uh, but having that knowledge of um, uh, of the system as a whole, you must have uh, found it quite familiar when you arrived in Australia with the acacia and the proteaceae and a lot of the grass genuses and even the species like the themata uh, being prevalent. So was it apart from kangaroos bounding around instead of elephants, rhinos, and giraffes? Was it? Uh, did you feel quite comfortable in the wild here?
Yes, in fact, probably too comfortable because I'd hear a little skink rustling, and then I'd be like, coming from Africa, jumping around, going, "Whoa, what's in the bush?" Something's there to eat me. But once I realized that I was no longer surrounded by these dangerous animals, and there's such intricate little unique mammals, especially in this country, and reptiles, of course, and birds, and it's just so much to learn, but at the same time, I was so comfortable knowing the system dynamics. Like you say, what are the drivers? What affect these systems? How do they function? What am I looking at? And yes, I would often be like, oh, that looks like Demeter triandra. And someone would go, yes, it is, which is, so I was learning, but at the same time, I was also recognizing certain species or genuses that are common. So very, very, very cool, very, very accepting, very comfortable. So
And
good.
the acacias are sort of dominant in the savannah in South Africa, is my understanding. Is there an equivalent to the eucalypts in the South African landscape uh, as they're sort of the dominant tree here?
That's the funny thing about eucalypts. We have a professor over at University of Cape Town, William Bond, who just says they're super trees. They're incredible, super fire-escaping trees, and we don't really have anything ecologically equivalent in Africa. When I think about iconic trees, maybe there's the marula tree, which is Sclerocarya virea, and you see that classic picture of the flat crown and acacias as well. So they're very thorny. Compared, the acacias you see here, there's no thorns because there's no mammals, so there's no need for that defense. So it's understanding the system again and comparing the species, even though they're the same genus. What are the differences and what are the drivers of the way they've evolved on different continents? It's so fascinating, and it's so great to have that insight and to be able to compare it. It's really great.
So when you're out there in the Kimberley Savannah, what's your favourite piece of gear, or what's essential for you when you're out?
You know what? More and more, it's becoming my iPad, which is terrible because But it really is. There's so many apps nowadays that are essential. So you can get everything on one little device. And also with Rangers, we're working on a data management system where we use this specific app instead of writing on a clipboard like I did back in the day. We now use an app to capture all our data. And as soon as we get back within Wi-Fi range, we just synchronize it and it all uploads into the cloud. And it's incredible the way technology is going. But yeah, we couldn't do without our iPads, unfortunately, or our tablets of some sort.
Okay, well, I usually ask the bird nerds what their field guide of choice is. So I am going to ask you that because I'm sure you've got a field guide.
Yeah, quite a few actually, especially coming from another country. I just try to accumulate as many as I can get. Yeah, but I think at the moment, the one that's my go-to has to be the native plants of Northern Australia for the moment.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And you're reliant on the iPad. So what is the app that you use the most when you're out and about?
My bird one. Gotta be.
And which one are you using?
Oh, I didn't even know there was more than one. Which one am I using? Let me check. Australian bird. Yeah, and I don't know. It just says Australian birds.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah. I think that's the one that we've all got.
Yeah.
Do you use things like iNaturalist as well when you're out and about?
I haven't used iNaturalist yet, but I've used there's different reference apps that are really useful. WA Field Guide, and when I was in the NT Field Guide, because we came over from Darwin recently. There's Euclid too, which is really, really good. Yeah, and then Frog ID, things like that. So great.
Everyone's using Frog ID.
Yeah, so, it's so good.
Yeah. No,
it's funny how we always want to name things around us, though. Hey, I want to know what's there. I want to know what I'm looking at. So it's really incredible. We can get this all electronically now. So it's great.
Being able to ID all the invertebrates and the fungi and lichens and mosses, it's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to have my little magnifying eyepiece and my little monoscope thing as well, and you could never work out what the species was. The resources just weren't there. You had to go into the herbarium or the state library for an afternoon with your specimens to do it. So
exactly.
Yeah, I mean it's opened up academic knowledge to so many people now. It's brilliant.
Great. Yeah,
it's brilliant. So let's see. Have you determined a favourite bird
in Australia?
Anywhere.
I suppose if it's anywhere, maybe it's the ground hornbill in South Africa. I just love those things. They're so quirky and funny. Do you know the ground hornbill? Have you heard of them?
No.
Because they're quite a big bird and they forage on the ground too, but they also nest in hollows. So it's kind of interesting. But they're quite big.
Did you say the hornbill?
Yes, ground hornbill.
Yeah.
The ground hornbill.
So that's the one that doesn't have a big cask on its beak or anything. It just kind of looks like the channel-billed cuckoo that we've got here, jumping around.
Much bigger.
Yeah, but or kind of like that, or a pheasant koosel, but with that big, yeah.
And they're black, mostly black, and they have like this red bit under there. Yeah. And really big beaks.
Yeah, yeah, and they hang around on the ground, kind of like the chuffs do here.
Yeah, they do, and they go after things too. You see them running after prey and getting it with their big long beak. That's why they're quite funny. I find them quite clownish because they push each other out the way to get at something. Go for a frog or something buried in the mud. So yeah, really interesting.
It's probably a very old world thing rather than what it's supposed to be. But I always think of hornbills whenever I see those two Mexican crows, those old Warner Brothers. Do you know the ones I mean?
Yeah.
I always think of hornbills when I think of them, but
Yeah.
the Americans wouldn't like that.
No.
And how about because you've had all that experience at Kruger, favorite animal?
Got to be the elephant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did my PhD on elephants, so I'm a bit biased. Yeah, they're incredible social animals and just so majestic. And yeah, I spent 3 years following them around, well, the breeding herds especially, looking at the weaned calf kind of feeding behavior compared to their adult parents, and it was just an incredible experience. I could spend my life following elephants around.
So have you picked up more elephant poo than anyone else in the world?
Probably. And measured it.
I've always wanted to meet a scatologist, and now I have.
I think you have. We're going to be collecting rock wallaby scat soon too. So.
Oh, well, that wasn't going to be the next question. The next question was going to be where is like somewhere you haven't been that you really, really, really want to go and check out the ecology?
Oh, gee, there's so many places. How do you choose? It's crazy.
Well, you have to. That's the rule.
Well, I suppose anywhere because there's so much to learn and so much, yeah. But maybe with our travel bubble at the moment, maybe New Zealand, so I can actually get there. I'd love to see some of the ground-dwelling birds there too, like the kiwi and the kakapo and all these crazy parrots. But then, there's less animals probably than I would. Lots of birds in New Zealand, and lots of interesting different ecology. But I still need to explore a lot of Australia, and I've concentrated in the north. So I love the northern Australia, and I still need to see more of the south. So that's my next trip has to be Southern Australia and into the southeast.
I know you came over from South Africa with your husband. Are you both working in the same field?
No, he's a tradie, so he works. Yeah, he can work anywhere.
So
but he made a lot of nest boxes for me very very early on. It's a really useful, practical person.
He's very good to have around. Well,
for sure.
Well, if you make it down to Victoria, I'll happily take you to 2 or 3 of the best coffee places. That's so.
You're going to say birding places.
No. There's much better qualified people you can catch up with many of the guests or Sean Dooley or someone to find all the good birding places.
Awesome. And the mammals. You need to see all the mammals down there.
Yeah. Actually, if you do go to Melbourne, you have to go to Royal Park. It's just out of the city, but it's a bit of a hotspot these days.
Oh,
so
nice. Thanks.
So what is next on your horizon? Have you got a 5 or 10-year plan?
What do you mean in conservation? How can you have that long-term plans? What is that? No, I'm really, I'm really loving working for WWF at the moment, and I'm fairly new to my role. I've only been here just over a year, so I really want to invest as much as I can into the Kimberley work and establishing a really great program across WA for WWF. So that's in the next 5 years at least, I'm hoping. That's what we'll be doing.
We probably should have tackled this right at the beginning, but how does WWF allocate its resources and the timelines for the projects? Like, is your role ongoing, or is it limited? Is it dependent on some external funding that is time limited?
Yes, it's my role's contracted, and most of the roles within our NGO are obviously, we're a charity. We're highly dependent on fluctuations and donations, and the work I do, while my salary is paid by WWF, the work that I do is funded externally by grants. So at the moment, we have a really great grant from Lottery West in WA, and they're incredibly generous and really supportive of our work. So we have an extensive project in the Kimberley funded through them at the moment. So that's currently what I'm working on, and we're also looking at scoping out various new projects in the southwest. But it's always chasing little bits of funding, just as anyone else does in this game. So yeah, it's not ideal, hey, but
it's the limiting factor and the main competitive pressure to your work. So, listeners, if you're in Western Australia, get on down and buy a Lottery West lottery ticket, and I think you can get online and go and do that, and that will help support WWF's work in the Kimberley in Western Australia. So, yeah, that's a really hard thing for all of you. And I say you because it's all the guests on this show who are doing conservation projects or doing research, is there's very little continuity for you in a career sense unless you're lucky enough to be tenured staff at a university.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And even then, it's, there's so much demand on your output, in a university setting, and those tenured positions it's incredible what work they do and how much they do, so even that security is not always fantastic, so I don't really mind the contracted work. It's just the longevity, like you say, of specific projects as such, or specific work that you're doing. It would be so great if we could have a 10-year outlook on anything we're doing, and partnerships, especially long-term partnerships, long-term projects. Wow, imagine that.
But isn't that the conundrum? And it's the thing that I guess comes up every time I speak to someone. Conserving endangered species is a long-term project, but the funding is continually rolling on a short-term basis. It seems like one of the dumbest kinds of decisions that governments can make. But I know I'm the only one who's allowed to say that, because everyone else is dependent on getting a grant in the next cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure, government also, in certain extent, also believes, that we need long-term funding, but they themselves are not
Well,
long-term.
but,
You know,
but
so,
but they're all going, oh, we can't commit to it because we might have to give in the next
exactly.
3 year cycle. We might have to give all the money to rugby league supporters, or so yeah. Or there
It's all
might there might
relative.
be a stupid road we have to build. So in a
Yeah.
marginal seat, exactly. No, look, that and that's the problem that is just never going to go away. I mean, in Australia, we're on a 3 year electoral cycle. Some states are on 4 years, but that means no planning is ever done past 2 years in terms of commitments the governments want to make. They're always revising their funding outlooks because as much as everyone says they don't do it, the pork barrel is alive and well. There's always a
Yeah.
freeway or a rail line to build. So
Yeah, that's
yeah,
true. It's all relative. And we're lucky at WWF establishing some long-term partnerships too, which is really great. And that's how you just build on the work that's come before and try and establish those really trusted long-term partnerships and then try and get longevity in your work. So there are some ways around it, but you're always chasing that funding, exactly as you said. So,
that's right.
oh well,
And
we
then
do the best we can.
And then all the giants like you, Leigh-ann, we have to remember that you're all standing on the shoulders of giants who have been standing on the shoulders of giants. Um,
Exactly.
and
Wow.
so much of the work that we all go to for information was done by volunteers or people living on the smell of an oily rag. And I think I wish more people in the boardrooms actually knew what the real living standards of the people who do the research uh, are or were, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
because because a little bit of money goes a long, long way in this game. So,
It does. It really does. And we're grateful for every cent and we try and make the most of it. So, yeah, buy
so
your Lottery West ticket.
that's right. Leigh-ann, perhaps we should be positive right at the end. You've got some partnerships with industry and corporate. So, are there any that you'd like to give a particular shout out to for the support they've given uh, in the work that you've been doing in the Kimberley?
Yeah, well, we work, like I said, Lottery West is our biggest supporter at the moment. We also have some state grants from state NRM, which is fantastic government grants. And we work collaboratively and closely with the Department of Biodiversity Conservation Attractions, so Parks and Wildlife, essentially. And we also, as I said before, in the Kimberley specifically, we work with the most incredible traditional owner groups and rangers. And really, a massive shout out goes to them. And the Kimberley Land Council is one of our partners too. The work that we do wouldn't be possible without them. So it's really, yeah, it talks to collaboration, what's needed, like you say, with the smell of an oily rag, how we get things done is through champions, passionate people, partnerships, and really getting things done on the ground through collaboration. So yeah, it's
Now,
great.
I didn't hear any of the ASX top 100 companies mentioned in there. So, come on, fellas, come on, ladies, come on down to the party.
Thanks.
Well, I think I think it needs to be said. There's a lot of money sloshing around, um, but people like you aren't getting hold of it. So, I would encourage Twiggy, before you dig your next hole in the ground, fling a bit of that, what's it called, Mindaroo money over to WWFWA, and help out the Gouldian Finches and the what are the other iconic species that your program is working on?
Yeah, well, the black-footed rock wallaby, or the willogy, is quite a dominant iconic species, and especially since it's just been given subspecies status. Before it was the Kimberley race, and now it's got full subspecies Kimberleyensis status. So it only occurs on 3 little rocky ranges in the Kimberley area, on Ninganamangala native tidal area. So it's critical. It's endangered, and it's critical that we make huge efforts for the management of this species on that land. And then we work across the North Kimberley too on so many different threatened species there that are, really in peril at the moment. And mostly, I suppose, the mammals get the kudos or the attention because they're the cute and cuddly ones.
The numbat.
Yeah. Yeah, the numbat, we are working on numbat down in the southwest, and the quokka down in the southwest. And up here, it's more about, I suppose, the native rat or rodent species don't get much attention, but there are some really incredible species up here: golden-backed tree rats and black-footed tree rats, and the brush-tailed rabbit rat that are in decline and in severe decline. And we're working across all groups to try and have a coordinated approach to threat management up here, with the cane toads marching across the Kimberley to the northern quolls in real peril. So we're trying to do the best we can for a lot of these species with our partners, working with our partners on the ground. So, yeah.
Well, it's a great job you do, Leigh-ann, with as we banged on about the limited resources, and thanks WWF for getting involved as well. Government departments can't do it all on their own, and certainly the TOs need a lot of assistance, and we need to find a way to utilise the generational knowledge held within those communities that can be applied to the conservation techniques that we're using in our society too. So I really like this interface that you guys have got going, Leigh-ann. It's been a pleasure to meet you. Thanks so much for giving us so much of your time. What's the best action a punter, just a general Joe or Josephine on the street can do? Should they be joining WWF or just donating to a special project? Or what would you encourage them to do?
I'd encourage them to visit our website and sign up with us and donate if they can. And that's wonderful. And there's also opportunities to be involved in citizen science projects through WWF and various other opportunities through us. But our donations page can tell you what we're up to, where we're doing it, and you can decide to donate in various levels and have various involvements. So yeah, it's a great, it would be wonderful if everyone could visit us and sign up and get involved.
And after you've done that, okay, make sure that you subscribe to the Bird Emergency podcast and follow me on Twitter at Bird Emergency. I don't usually do a plug, but you were doing such a good job. Yeah. You were doing such a good job. I got motivated.
Awesome.
Well, Leigh-ann, I hope we can talk again sometime down the track and see how that Gouldian project is going and how the birds are faring, and find out what you're up to next. Hopefully that's 10 years time you're still at WWF and you're the conservation director for the nation or something.
So, gosh. Too ambitious.
So,
thanks so much, Brian. Really appreciate being on the Bird Emergency. It's really great. Thank you for raising awareness for all our birds in peril.
Well, somebody's got to do it. I mean, there's plenty of people out there doing it. We all need to be out there doing it. So, yeah. And look, dear listener, I hope you're enjoying what we're doing, and just share the message. Share the message. Okay. I'm Grant
Thank you.
Williams. Thanks for listening.